John Radcliffe, a name that had become synonymous with power and wealth, sat in the courtroom, his once confident demeanor now replaced by uncertainty. He had built his empire from the ground up, everything from real estate to technology investments, and his name was attached to some of the most recognizable brands in the world. But now, it was all in jeopardy. The case at hand wasn't about corruption or criminal wrongdoing, no. Instead, it was about ownership, the right to everything he had ever worked for. His estranged brother, Edward, had surfaced after more than 20 years of silence, claiming that he had a legal right to part of John's estate. The accusation that John had used a trust their late father had established to secure his fortune, but had kept Edward out of the deal. It was a family dispute that had turned into a battle of legal titans. The courtroom buzzed with tension. John's legal team, one of the finest in the world, sat poised to discredit every claim Edward had made. But John knew better than to underestimate his brother. Edward had never been the kind of man to seek the limelight. Instead, he was the shadow, always present in the background, waiting for the right moment to strike. John's mind raced as he listened to Edward's attorney, a sharp, calculating man named James Carter, paint a picture of deceit. Carter laid out evidence of documents that appeared to give Edward a stake in the trust, documents that were claimed to be overlooked for decades. John's heart sank as his entire legacy was questioned in front of a jury, many of whom were clearly swayed by the emotional appeal of a family torn apart by greed. Days turned into weeks as the trial dragged on. Witnesses were called, each with their own version of the truth, from former business partners to childhood friends. The courtroom was filled with testimonies, some that painted John as a ruthless businessman, others that showed him as a man of vision. But there was one thing they all agreed on: John's fortune had changed the world. As the trial continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about money. Edward's intentions were far more than financial, they were personal. Edward had spent the last 2 decades in the shadows, watching his brother's success from afar, while he struggled in the shadows of their father's legacy. It was a complex web of resentment and rivalry, one that had festered over years of silence. The pivotal moment came when John took the stand. He had prepared himself to defend not just his wealth, but the choices he had made over the years. He spoke about their father's expectations and how he had never been given the opportunity to be more than the other son in the eyes of the family. But John's words didn't just defend his actions, they exposed the emotional scars of a family divided by ambition, loss, and the price of success. As the final arguments were made, both sides seemed evenly matched. The jury was left to deliberate, but John knew the outcome was out of his hands. What he didn't know was whether this battle would be the one that ultimately defined him. Would he win? Or would he lose everything he had built? The days that followed the closing arguments were filled with an unsettling stillness. The jury had retired to deliberate, and the courtroom had emptied, leaving only the echo of the hardwood floors beneath the footsteps of those who had spent the last few weeks in the midst of the battle. John's mind was clouded with a mixture of dread and determination. He had been at the top of his game for so long, but now it felt like everything was slipping through his fingers. The wealth, the power, the recognition, none of it mattered if he lost this fight. His legacy would crumble, not just in the eyes of the world, but also in the eyes of his own family. He couldn't help but think of his late father, who had always expected greatness from both him and Edward. But his father had never given them the same opportunities. It had always been John who had been pushed to achieve, who had been trained to take the reins of the family's business empire. Edward, on the other hand, had been neglected, overshadowed by John's ambition and drive. John couldn't recall a time when his brother had ever gotten the same attention or praise, but now, it was as though Edward had risen from the ashes, demanding what he believed was his birthright. But was it really his birthright? John leaned back in his chair, staring at the pile of legal papers in front of him. His legal team had assured him that the trust documents were solid, that no one could prove Edward's claims of mismanagement or deceit. And yet, there was something about this case that felt different. This wasn't just about the law, it was about family. It was about the bond that had long been fractured between two brothers who had grown up in the same house but had lived in completely different worlds. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and his attorney, Sarah Mitchell, walked in, her face a mask of professionalism, but even she couldn't hide the strain in her eyes. She had been with him through the ups and downs, but this was the hardest case they had ever taken on. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting down across from him. John gave a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "How do you think I'm holding up? My entire life is in the hands of 12 strangers." "I know," Sarah said, her voice softer than usual. "But we've done everything we can. We've presented the facts. Now we just have to wait." John nodded, but the waiting was the hardest part. It felt as though the world had slowed down, every second dragging longer than the last. It had been 2 days since the jury had begun deliberating, and John was beginning to lose hope. Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and the tension in the air thickened. The jury was returning. John's heart raced as he stood up, his legs feeling like lead. The silence in the room was deafening, every set of eyes locked on the jury as they filed into their seats. The foreman, an older man with a weary expression, stood up. The judge looked over at him, signaling for the verdict to be read. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Edward Radcliffe," the foreman said, his voice firm. "The trust documents were improperly handled, and Edward Radcliffe is entitled to a portion of the estate." The words hit John like a physical blow. His entire body seemed to freeze as the weight of the verdict sank in. He had lost. As the courtroom erupted into murmurs, John stood there, stunned, unable to process what had just happened. He had fought so hard, believing that he could win, believing that the years of hard work, the sacrifices, the risks he had taken, all of it would be enough to protect what he had built. But in the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about his family, his brother, the invisible wounds that had never healed. Edward had won, but at what cost? John walked out of the courtroom, his thoughts a blur. The future that had once seemed so certain now felt uncertain, like a ship adrift at sea. The world he had worked so tirelessly to create was now in question. His brother was entitled to a portion of it, but at what price would this victory come? Would this be the end of their relationship? Or would it mark the beginning of a new chapter, one where the bitterness of the past could finally be put to rest? For John Radcliffe, the fight was far from over. This battle in the courtroom had been lost, but the war for his legacy was just beginning. John stepped out of the courtroom, the weight of the verdict pressing down on him like an anchor. His thoughts were a whirlwind of disbelief and anger, his mind unable to process the reality of what had just happened. Edward's victory was not just a financial blow, it felt like a betrayal, like everything he had worked for had been reduced to a mere commodity to be divided. As he walked through the crowded hallway, the buzz of conversations and the clatter of footsteps seemed distant, muffled, like he was hearing it from another world. He had always been a man of action, a man who knew how to control situations, to steer his destiny. But now, it felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking down at a future that had no direction. "Mr. Radcliffe," a voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah Mitchell, his lawyer, walking toward him with a concerned look on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, though he felt far from it. "I don't know what to do now." Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There's something you need to understand. This case is far from over. Yes, Edward won this battle, but the war isn't finished. You have options." John's eyes narrowed, a flicker of hope stirring in his chest. "What do you mean?" "The jury's verdict is final." "How can I fight this?" "Legally, yes. But there's always room for negotiation. Edward may have won in court, but that doesn't mean he has the support of the public or the rest of the family. You could still leverage your connections, your influence. You've built more than just an empire, you've built relationships that can help you." John's mind raced. He had the connections, the power, the influence. But was that enough to reclaim what was his? And more importantly, was it worth the cost of further tearing apart the fragile remnants of his relationship with his brother? "I can't believe this is happening," he muttered under his breath. "I didn't think Edward would go this far. He's never been this Relentless. Sarah looked at him sympathetically. Sometimes, when people feel they've been wronged, they'll stop at nothing to get what they think they deserve. But this doesn't mean you have to let him take everything. You can still fight back, on your terms. John ran a hand through his hair, trying to absorb her words. He knew Sarah was right. There was always a way forward. But the question was, what kind of person would he become in the process? Days passed and the reality of the verdict began to settle in. John found himself at a crossroads, torn between fighting back and attempting to reconcile with his brother. He spent hours in meetings with his financial advisors, looking at the finer details of the trust and his assets. There were ways to challenge the division, but they would take time, money, and a level of public scrutiny that John wasn't sure he was prepared to endure. The thought of airing his dirty laundry in public, of dragging his family's name through the mud, didn't sit well with him. But as he sat in his office one evening, staring at the papers in front of him, he heard a knock at the door. "Come in," he called. The door opened, and to his surprise, it was Edward. He stood there, looking slightly uncomfortable, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a rare moment of vulnerability. His eyes were softer than usual, though there was still a hint of triumph in his gaze. "I thought I might find you here," Edward said, his voice almost hesitant. John looked up, his expression guarded. "What do you want?" Edward took a step forward, then paused. "I know this isn't easy, John. I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted to fight you. But after everything that happened, I had no choice." John scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "No choice? You could have chosen to leave it all behind, to let things go. But instead, you decided to rip everything apart." "I did what I had to do," Edward replied. "And maybe you're right. Maybe I should have done things differently. But you have to understand, John. All these years, I was watching you from the sidelines, seeing you take everything that was meant to be shared between us. Our father's legacy, the family business. It was all supposed to be ours, not just yours." John stood up, feeling the heat of frustration rising within him. "You think you were robbed of something? Edward, you had every opportunity to step up. You chose to walk away. I didn't force you to do anything." Edward's face tightened, but he didn't back down. "You were always the golden child, the one who got all the praise. I was left in the shadow of your success. But I'm not here to blame you anymore. I just want what's mine. What I'm owed." The silence in the room stretched for a moment, both brothers standing there, their shared history hanging heavily between them. John didn't know how to respond. His anger was still there, but so was something else, a sense of regret, a longing for something that had long been lost. "What now?" John finally asked, his voice low. Edward sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Now? Now, we find a way forward. Not for the money, but for what's left of us, what's left of this family. I'm not asking you to forgive me, but I want you to understand that I did what I did for a reason. And maybe, just maybe, we can figure out a way to rebuild. Together." John looked at his brother, the words hanging in the air between them. Could he forgive him? Could he let go of the years of resentment and pride, and find a way to move forward? The answer was unclear. But one thing was certain, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the room was suffocating. John stood there, the weight of Edward's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. He felt torn, his years of effort, his ambition, everything he had sacrificed now being questioned by his own flesh and blood. Edward's apology, though genuine, couldn't erase the years of frustration, the feeling of being betrayed by someone who should have been his ally. John ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the words that would bridge the chasm between them. The hurt, the anger, it was all so raw. But Edward's offer to rebuild was tempting. Could they really do this? Could they repair the fractures, not just in their relationship, but in everything they had built? "What's your plan, Edward?" John asked, his voice colder than he intended. Edward shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I know I've done things that can't be undone. But I'm asking for a chance to work together, if you'll let me." John felt a surge of skepticism rise in his chest. Work together. It sounded too simple, too convenient. The years of competition, the silent resentment, the battles for their father's approval, they couldn't all be wiped away by a single conversation. But as much as John hated to admit it, there was something about the vulnerability in his brother's voice that made him pause. Edward wasn't the same man he had been. John could see it in his eyes, the weariness, the regret. For the first time, he wondered if maybe Edward wasn't just trying to take what he felt was owed to him. Maybe he was trying to find a way to move forward, to build something together. "I don't know, Edward," John said, taking a seat behind his desk. "You asked me to trust you again, but we both know trust isn't something you can just give. It's earned. And I've spent years building this empire, everything from scratch. I can't just hand it over." Edward nodded, his gaze never leaving John. "I don't want to take anything from you, John. I'm not asking to take over. I'm asking to be a part of it, to help you, to fix what's broken." John let out a sigh, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. "It's not just about fixing things, Edward. There are too many people who've been affected by this. The investors, the clients, the public. You've already caused a stir by taking me to court. There's no going back to how things were." Edward's eyes darkened, but he held his ground. "I know. I've been a fool, and I've made mistakes. But we can make it right. Together, we have the power to change things, to make this company even bigger than it was before. I'm not asking for everything, John. I'm asking for a partnership." John leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Could he really go down this path? He had always been the one in control, the one making the decisions. The idea of sharing that with someone who had spent years on the sidelines, watching, waiting for his chance, felt uncomfortable. But Edward wasn't the same person he had been. He had proven that in the courtroom, and now, perhaps, he was showing his true intentions. "I'll think about it," John said finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "But don't think this means I'm ready to forgive you just yet. You'll have to prove you're worthy of a second chance." Edward's face softened, a look of relief washing over him. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't shut me out." John watched as Edward left the office, the door closing softly behind him. His thoughts were a storm of conflicting emotions. He had spent so long fighting against everything Edward represented, and now, here he was, being asked to consider something he had never imagined, a partnership. The next few days were filled with restless nights and endless meetings. John couldn't shake the conversation with Edward from his mind. Every time he thought he was ready to make a decision, doubt crept in. It wasn't just about the business, it was about family, about healing a rift that had been growing for decades. But as the weeks went on, John began to see the cracks in his own armor. The pressure from his investors, the media, the public, it was mounting. He couldn't carry the weight of the empire alone forever. And as much as he hated to admit it, perhaps Edward could be the key to moving forward. Not as a replacement, but as a partner, someone who could balance his strengths with his own weaknesses. John knew that nothing would ever be the same again, no matter what he chose. The court case had left a mark on his reputation, and the family drama had splashed across headlines for weeks. But in the midst of all this chaos, there was an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to redefine what success meant. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John picked up the phone and dialed Edward's number. "Edward," John said, his voice steady, though there was a hint of emotion beneath the calm. "Let's meet. I've been thinking about what you said. And I think I'm willing to give this partnership a chance. But understand this, if we do this, we do it on my terms. No more games. No more hiding." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Edward spoke, his voice was filled with gratitude. "I won't let you down, John. I promise." As John hung up the phone, a strange sense of peace washed over him. The road ahead was uncertain and the journey would be anything but easy. But for the first time in years, he felt as though he was stepping forward, not as a solitary figure, but as someone who could face the future with the possibility of rebuilding what had been lost. The following months passed in a blur of high-stakes meetings, tense negotiations, and strained compromises. John and Edward worked side by side, though the air between them was often thick with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Their partnership, while initially a glimmer of hope, proved to be far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The media had long moved on from their courtroom drama, but the repercussions lingered. Their company, once a beacon of success, now faced scrutiny from investors who were wary of the brothers' ability to work together. There were whispers of tension, of cracks in the foundation that had once seemed unbreakable. John struggled with letting go of control. For years, he had made every decision, trusted no one, and carried the weight of his empire alone. Now, he found himself having to share the burden with Edward, a man who had once been his rival, and who, despite his sincerity, still held deep-seated resentments. Edward, on the other hand, found himself grappling with his own demons. He had always lived in the shadow of John's success, watching from afar as his brother thrived, and now that he was finally part of the equation, he couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. Every move he made, every decision he suggested, was met with John's silent resistance or passive-aggressive remarks. It was as though the scars of the past were always just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface at the first sign of weakness. But despite the tension, despite the constant push and pull, there were moments of progress. Small victories, like successfully closing a major deal or finding a new avenue for growth, kept them moving forward. John couldn't deny that Edward's business acumen and fresh perspective brought something valuable to the table, but the price of that was the constant friction between them. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, the brothers sat in John's office, staring at a financial report that seemed to represent everything they had fought for and everything they had lost. "You know," Edward said, breaking the silence, "for all the years we spent apart, I never thought we'd be here. I thought the fight would be over by now." John leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the report. "The fight is never really over, Edward. It just changes form. You fight to build something, then you fight to protect it. And when it seems like it's all slipping away, you fight harder." Edward's eyes softened, and for the first time in months, John saw a flicker of the brother he had once known, a man who wasn't just driven by ambition, but by a desire to make things right. It was fleeting, but it was enough. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we were," Edward continued. "But I do know one thing, we are stronger together than apart. And maybe that's enough." John nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had spent so much time trying to protect his empire, to guard it from every possible threat, that he had forgotten the most important part of it all, the people. His family. His brother. Despite everything, they were still connected by the same blood, the same history, the same legacy. And maybe that was worth fighting for. "Maybe you're right," John said, his voice quieter than usual. "Maybe we've spent too long fighting the wrong battle." Edward smiled faintly, the first real smile John had seen from him in months. It wasn't a smile of victory or triumph, it was a smile of acceptance, of a shared understanding. As the weeks turned into months, the brothers worked together, cautiously at first, then more confidently as they learned to navigate the complexities of their new partnership. The company slowly began to recover, gaining traction in new markets and earning back the trust of their investors. The road was still bumpy, and there were moments when old wounds resurfaced, but each time, they faced it together. John and Edward had rebuilt not just their business, but their relationship. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And in the end, that was all they needed. Their legacy, once at risk of being torn apart by pride and ambition, now stood as a testament to the possibility of redemption, not just in business, but in family. And for John, that was enough.